If you think Russian soldiers are the elite warriors they claim to be, think again. After 2.5 years of fighting a smaller, supposedly weaker enemy, Russia's troops have shown just how unprepared they are. Ukraine's forces have taken more Russian land in a month than Russia managed to capture in 7. So what's going wrong for Russians? Simple, they're soldiers. Today, we dive into how these conscripted, under-trained recruits stack up against the world's most powerful army, the US. Spoiler, they don't. Here we go, let's start with some of the basics, such as how the US and Russian armies are trained. Russia has two main ways of obtaining more troops for its army: conscription and contract soldiers, sometimes called kontraktniki. By contrast, the US only employs contract soldiers, what's commonly called enlistment. However, the actual process of enlisting US and Russian soldiers varies quite a bit between the two countries. In the US, the first step of becoming a soldier is undergoing basic combat training, or BCT. This lasts for 10 weeks, including the reception and physical fitness tests during the first week. It's separated into 4 relatively distinct phases, during which all recruits are trained, both mentally and physically, for their capabilities and options within the US Army. Throughout the first few weeks of BCT, trainees are under nearly constant supervision by their drill sergeants, and the focus is on drilling in vital habits, discipline, teamwork, and passing on the traditions inherent to the US Army. Subsequent phases focus on building the recruits' hard skills such as hand-to-hand combat, weapons handling, and familiarization with equipment and life combat skills. The last 3 phases all contain one or more tests or field exercises that recruits have to pass to advance to the next phase, or they're forced to repeat the phase with the next batch, effectively prolonging BCT. After basic training, the US Army provides what is called Advanced Individual Training, or AIT, which is where the graduates can decide on, or be assigned, different branches or positions within the Army. AIT is highly customized based on the position or job that the recruit is aiming for, and some have civilian equivalents. For the basic soldier, advanced infantry training can last from 4 to 52 weeks at one of the infantry schools in the country. As far as somewhat similar ground-based roles are concerned, armor crewmen, combat engineers, and cavalry scouts receive between 14 and 22 weeks training. Additionally, these roles can complete their basic and advanced training in a single program called One Station Unit Training, or OSUT. The OSUT lasts for 22 weeks, effectively compressing BCT and ATI into a single course, where the recruit undergoes the first few phases of basic training and then immediately goes to advanced training, without the final stages of basic training or transfers to another training facility. The process allows a recruit to complete their training in a single location, with drill sergeants shared between the 2 phases of the training. If you thought this was complex, Russian soldier training is even more so. Since the Russian military system accepts conscripts and contract soldiers, the training is further separated between those 2 aspects. Conscripts have to undergo 1 or 2 months of basic training, which is similar to but typically less intensive than the US Army's BCT. After that, conscripts are run through more specialized training programs, which last between 3 and 6 months, depending on the position that the conscript will fill after the training. However, it should be noted that conscripts are generally not expected to see active combat, since conscription lasts for only 1 year and can significantly alter unit makeup. On the other hand, contract soldiers in Russia undergo more specialized and extensive training regimes. The basic training portion, called Intensive Combined Arms Training, lasts only 4 weeks, compared to 10 in the US. The phase ends with a 4-day training event to help prepare the recruit for active duty or additional training. After that, contract soldiers are put through specialized training depending on their intended or assigned role, which typically lasts a few months. Typically, contract soldiers in Russia receive a similar level of combat training over the course of their first year as US Army recruits do during their OSUTs or ATIs. However, Russian training typically begins and ends with the needs of the unit and simulated live-fire combat training. The point of the training in the Russian army is to drill into the recruits the knowledge of basic combat principles, adherence to the rules, and common military tactics that the Russian officers might use during active duty. While comprehensive, one of the most frequent setbacks of this method is that it doesn't leave much room for adaptation. Since the units are typically trained independently and receive most directions from the direct commanding officer, there's little cooperation between different units or branches of the military, especially on the ground. This has led to a surprising number of problems for Russia over the years. For example, some of the officers in 2016 were fired from the army because they claimed that the units received much more training compared to others. This verticality, especially in terms of accountability and chain of command progression, means that the Russian troops are primarily guided by loose and vague instructions from the top commanders. In the meantime, the unit officers can misconstrue those instructions in any way they see fit if they are not properly overseen. To alleviate the issue, a 2017 General Staff reform was created to reduce the number of conscripts and allow them to transition into contract soldiers more effectively. On paper, this should create a less polarized experience between contract and conscripted soldiers. However, the core of the issue remains in the Russian army's highly decentralized training structure. Without a unified unit command and training protocol, each unit is left to the commander to oversee, which allows for the same issues to perpetuate themselves through lower army service duration and constant reconscription. On the other hand, the US Army uses more extensive group training methods, which include cross-unit military exercises, meant to prepare the soldiers for the erratic and unpredictable nature of live combat. As such, the officers have greater control over their units, but also have more codependence on nearby units during active duty. When combined with the prolonged nature of OSUT, which has all recruits train in a single location under the same drill sergeants, this builds up much stronger morale and camaraderie between the US soldiers. Additionally, due to the dual nature of recruiting within the Russian army and the shorter enlistment period for conscripts, they are widely considered either more expendable or less skilled than the contract soldiers. This means they are not expected to see actual combat, and therefore, their training might not actually be done up to the same standards that the contract soldiers or the US recruits receive. Furthermore, since conscription is mandatory, i.e. the recruit didn't actually choose to enter the army, they likely have much lower morale than the soldier who approached the recruitment center willingly to serve their country for the next few years. You might have seen the ramifications of that during the past few weeks of the Russo-Ukrainian War. The Russian army has staffed the northern parts of the Russo-Ukrainian border primarily with recruits, i.e. soldiers who have not received nearly as much training as Western troops, including Ukrainians. This is one of the main reasons why Ukraine has managed to achieve the scope of the victories it did in the Kursk region. Pretty much the same concept can be applied to the Russian summer campaign of 2024, which was split between the Kharkiv region and the currently active Eastern Front in the Donetsk region. The Russian army has used less experienced troops to invade Kharkiv, where it's relied on primarily infantry tactics. The result of the summer campaign was Russia accumulating over 1,200 casualties per day, with the total tally being some 70,000 soldiers lost over the 2 months that the campaign has unofficially lasted. When discussing soldier training, it's also important to broach the subject of service times. In the US, a soldier is obligated to sign an 8-year service commitment, which is split between active and reserve duty. The minimum active service duration is 2 years, during which a soldier can be deployed at any time. Typically, soldiers will serve for 4 years and then get another 4 years of reserve duty. Of course, a soldier can re-enlist after the initial contract. On the other hand, Russian conscription lasts 1 year. They have the option to renew their military service and become contract soldiers to prolong their service commitment and earn more money in the process. However, a service soldier's commitment only lasts for 3 years and then can be renewed if needed. The stark difference in service commitments between the US and Russian armies means that the US has a significant advantage when it comes to preparing its soldiers for actual combat. With near-mandatory conscription, typically roughly 1/3 of the viable population each year has been called to serve in the army in Russia, Russian troops see much more turnover. This is especially notable for the first few years of military service. If a conscript doesn't enlist as a contract soldier, then they have only 1 year of experience in the army, and even that might not have brought them up to par. By contrast, contract soldiers are typically encouraged to re-enlist a few times, but even that isn't certain. What inevitably ends up happening in this system is that Russia has a very limited number of people who have actually signed up to be in the army, especially compared to the overall amount of troops. Worse yet, since conscripts are generally considered less willing and capable and are generally not expected to be deployed in active combat situations without signing up for a contract, their initial training experience can vary wildly between one unit and the next. Even if the unit commanders want to make sure to spend enough time with recruits to provide adequate training, the constant influx of new conscripts means that each year, or 6 months since there are 2 conscription periods per year, comes with a new batch of recruits to train, which are then mixed in with the more experienced soldiers. As a result, the actual contract soldiers might not receive enough viable training for combat missions due to the command not having enough staff or time to provide it. Therefore, it's safe to say that the US system is designed to create more experienced soldiers who have better bonds with their unit. Furthermore, the more centralized training system that the US uses for BCT and OSUT allows for far more oversight and control over how soldiers come out of basic training and enter active military service. But let's go beyond how soldiers are trained and discuss what each soldier brings to the front: the equipment. Starting with body armor, Russian and American armed forces don't differ that much in terms of body protection. The US-issued modular scalable vest with ESAPI inserts, which are ceramic plates strategically placed around the armor, are similar in appearance and shock absorption to the Russian 6B43 and 6B45 vests used in the newest iteration of the Ratnik II infantry kit system, which also incorporates ceramic plate armor. However, the Russian body armor system is slightly more old school compared to the US designs, providing more protection over the neck and other peripheral areas, as well as containing softer backers to add bulk. While this should make the soldier more protected in theory, in practice, the US design allows for slightly more maneuverability in the field, which has been pivotal for US soldiers stationed in the Middle East throughout the war on terrorism. The US has also been experimenting with a more unit-based approach to vest orders and designs, making them less one-size-fits-all and more customized for particular situations, as well as replacing ceramic plate inserts with steel ones. Steel has a few pros and cons over ceramic. On the plus side, it's much easier to produce steel plates, and a steel plate doesn't actually completely break upon impact with a rifle bullet, allowing it to potentially catch more bullets. On the downside, bullets tend to shatter and spoil the plate itself, which can increase the amount of shrapnel that can pierce the inner armor layer and cause harm. Additionally, steel plates are typically much heavier than ceramic ones for the appropriate level of protection. Weight has been a recurring issue for modern soldiers, as the fighting load has been increasing steadily over the past decades. However, the US soldiers have the benefit of vastly improved gear interchangeability and weight capability. This is due to the modular scalable vests being fully compatible with modular lightweight load-carrying equipment pouches. This means that soldiers can get customized kits for each mission without changing the basic body armor and equipment they carry. This can be a significant benefit that allows soldiers to shed some weight in encounters, considering that modern US soldier gear can weigh over 88 pounds for the fighting load and close to 140 pounds for the approach load. Speaking of gear, the US soldiers typically carry much more of it compared to Russian forces. However, this could be due to the previous instances of modern warfare involving American troops all being on foreign soil. The Russian army is brought up mainly for national defense, despite the irony of it currently invading a neighboring country. But perhaps the most significant difference in equipment is the standard-issue rifle for the armies. On the US side, that's the M4A1, although it's soon going to be replaced with the XM7. On the Russian side, the honor goes to the AK-74M. Both rifles are generally considered among the top options for modern militaries, but they have minor differences that accumulate to create vastly different combat experiences. When it comes to accuracy, the M4 is more accurate, especially at longer ranges. This is in part due to the rifle's lower recoil compared to the AK, giving the soldier a steadier aim for prolonged firefights. The AK, however, withstands those longer fights much better. Its simpler, more robust design makes it more functional after firing hundreds of rounds in short periods, while the M4 is said to burn. The focus on practicality in the AK is also accentuated by the rifle being practically impossible to jam. Some military experts suggest that the AK can be dragged through rain and mud, and that the mechanism will knock out the mud from the barrel while firing and make it work. The M4, in contrast, is more finicky and doesn't tolerate rough handling as well. However, the M4 wins out by being better for silent operations and more adaptable to its users, particularly due to a range of applicable add-ons. The M4 is also considered to be slightly more difficult to learn, but an experienced operator will likely be far more proficient in combat as a result of it. At the same time, since it's made from aluminium rather than steel, the M4 weighs less, making it easier to train on, and also ties into the aforementioned issues of soldiers carrying more and more weight. In the end, the M4 is more of a weapon for a professional army sent out on seek and destroy missions, while the AK-74 is better for long-term engagements with a larger army that needs to be mindful of its resources. These differences perhaps best showcase the true separation between the US and Russian troops. The US Army is focused on bringing out the highest potential in every single soldier, giving them more cutting-edge weaponry and equipment to withstand multiple operations. The Russian Army, on the other hand, is more about sheer numbers and the ability to pick up a weapon and get relatively proficient with it in a matter of weeks. While neither option is quite superior in all regards, the M4 wins out since it's a more effective weapon in the hands of a professional soldier. This plays especially well into the previously mentioned discrepancies in how long the Russian soldiers are trained. With steadier, more consistent and longer training, the US soldier can have years of experience with their M4. In situations where needs demand it, they can pick up an enemy's AK and still remain deadly. The same couldn't be said for a Russian conscript. Throughout all of this, we've mentioned military training and equipment as they were before the start of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And while the same theoretical concepts applied to the Russian forces, there's bound to be a bit of change. Unfortunately for Russia, that change is backward. This is easily explained by a simple number: 643,750. That's how many casualties the Russian army has accrued at the time of the writing of this video, according to Ukrainska Pravda, a news outlet that tracks daily events in the war. Compare that to the official number of soldiers that the Russian army has, which is around 1.3 million, and the CSIS report that suggests there were roughly 140,000 soldiers deployed around Ukraine at the start of the invasion. Additionally, Business Insider has stated that Russia's conscription efforts have greatly sped up over the invasion, leading to the recruitment of 30,000 people per month into the Russian army. Finally, the maximum age of conscription in Russia has been increased from 27 to 30, allowing the country to tap into a larger percentage of the population. All of these figures paint a clear picture of the state of the Russian army, one that's approaching shambles. If the training before the invasion was considered to be inconsistent, then the post-invasion training is likely going to be severely lacking. Furthermore, with the sheer number of casualties that Russia has suffered, chances are it's slowly running out of more experienced soldiers and replacing them with fresh recruits. The new conscripts have relatively little experience in actual combat and are unlikely to have gone through the Russian simulation exercises, as inadequate as they might be for modern warfare. A harrowing report from the Moscow Times has suggested that some conscripts receive as little as a week of training before being rotated into active service. This is nowhere near enough time for a recruit to learn how to use a combat rifle effectively. It suggests that Russia is more concerned about having enough bodies to throw at the Ukrainians and hoping that the more experienced soldiers evade bullets in the confusion. This means that the average US soldier is going to be much more experienced and therefore deadlier than a Russian one. As a whole, the Russian army has likely fallen far below the respected second place, as evidenced by its failings to not only invade Ukraine, but protect its own territory from being invaded in turn. Despite all this, there haven't been that many chances to see how US and Russian troops compare in action. The two countries have been on the opposing side of conflicts over the past decade, but the bulk of their investment was done through long-range warfare and donations rather than actual engagements. However, there are some clues on how Russian soldiers would fail to stack up to their American counterparts. First, let's go to the other side of the Russo-Ukrainian war for a bit. The Ukrainian army has been on the receiving end of billions of dollars worth of NATO equipment, but the army has also received training from NATO forces, which closely correlates to that of what the US provides to its national troops. But the core of the transformation of the Ukrainian army started all the way back in 2015, a year after Russia annexed Crimea. The army reform has implemented similar training regimes and command protocols to the US and the rest of NATO, bringing the Ukrainian army more in line with the Western systems. This means that the Ukrainian army, that's been fighting Russia for more than 2.5 years, is now using, if not the same advanced equipment, the same military strategy and training opportunities that the US has. Furthermore, Ukraine's experience with losing Crimea and the ongoing conflict in Donbass, which has been raging since 2014, means that the upper echelons of the Ukrainian army have a decade of active combat experience to rely on. Combined with the US-based training system, a Ukrainian soldier is perhaps the closest approximation to the US soldier, at least in terms of what Russia is experiencing at the moment. And Ukraine has far fewer soldiers than either the US or Russia, yet has managed to withstand an onslaught of a much stronger enemy. For the second way to ascertain how the US soldiers might stack up to Russian ones, let's go a bit further into the past and to the aforementioned proxy involvement. It's February 2018 in Syria. The US Special Forces were called in to provide ongoing support to the Syrian Democratic Forces against ISIS. On the other side of the conflict, the Wagner Group, one of Russia's private military/mercenary companies, has seized oil and gas fields in Syria to choke the country's government out of resisting. A team of 40 Special Forces soldiers with 3 MATVs and a single MARP truck was set up in a refinery that the Wagner company decided to try and occupy as their latest conquest. Wagner rolled in with 27 armored vehicles, of which 10 were tanks and roughly 500 troops. With those numbers alone, you'd think that the US team would be absolutely annihilated if Wagner decided to make use of the tanks and pushed with their sheer troop size. What happened was perhaps nothing short of a miracle. The Wagner tanks kept missing the US vehicles. The US Special Forces managed to deploy 2 pairs of Apache helicopters to the scene, and Wagner had 1 anti-aircraft cannon, a Zu-32. According to the extensive report published by the Warhorse, the US Special Forces suffered 0 casualties as a result of the attack. On the other hand, 9 out of the 10 tanks from Wagner were destroyed, with reports suggesting that anywhere between 100 and 300 soldiers died. A Wagner veteran on the scene suggested, "They tore us to pieces, they beat our asses like we were little pieces of shit." The disparity between Special Forces and the regular US Army soldiers aside, the scene showcased the sheer control and advanced tactics that the US Army can use in a theoretical conflict against Russia. Finally, there's another piece of the puzzle in the US versus Russia troop comparison: mechanized platoon tactics. The US mechanized platoons are more organized and resilient than their Russian counterparts. One of the main differences comes from the military equipment that the US uses. By all accounts, the modern armored vehicles from the US are vastly superior to Russia's vehicles. Take for example the US Bradley versus the Russian BMP. The Bradley has more armor built into the chassis, a digitized battle management and communication system, and can even carry 50% more missiles to use against opposing tanks. Furthermore, the US uses 4 vehicles per platoon compared to Russia's 3. If Russia loses a vehicle, which it likely might since both its tanks and armored vehicles have inferior protective plating and the US can bring more missiles to bear, a platoon is out of a third of its mechanized firepower. Losing another vehicle drops that down to a single vehicle's worth of battlefield control. The US has more advanced military equipment and is poised to use more of it and more offensively. Russia simply can't compare in that regard. And while the common infantry soldier is considered the backbone of any army, modern warfare has shown that technological advancement in vehicles and long-range, impersonal combat is making a bigger impact. Ukraine is a prime example, bringing Russia to heel primarily with drones and NATO-donated missiles. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments section below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out Shoot to Kill: How Many Soldiers Can Do This, or click this other video instead.